History tells us the West was won by gunslingers and lawmen, but the mountains keep secrets that history books refuse to write down. In the winter of 1878, a disgraced recluse named Thaddeus McCall vanished into the San Juan wilderness, vowing never to speak to another soul. He thought he was the only thing living at 10,000 feet. He was wrong. What he found tracking a blood trail through the snow wasn't a beast, and it wasn't a ghost. It was a girl running on all fours alongside a pack of grey timber wolves. This is the true untold story of the wolf girl of the Rockies, and the man who had to become a monster to save her. The wind didn't howl in the Uncompahgre wilderness. It screamed. At 10,000 feet, the air was thin enough to make a lowland man dizzy and cold enough to snap a pine branch like a dry bone. Thaddeus McCall preferred it that way. The cold kept the memories numb. The altitude kept the bounty hunters away. It was late October 1878. The first heavy snows had already buried the high passes, sealing Thaddeus into his valley for the season. He was a man carved from granite and regret 40 years old, with a beard like rusted wire and eyes that had seen too much of the war and too little of mercy. He lived in a cabin built against a rock face hidden so well that a man could walk within 10 feet of it and see nothing but nature. Thaddeus adjusted the strap of his Sharps rifle, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He was checking his trap line along the frozen creek bed. Beaver were scarce this high up, but marten and fox were plentiful. He wasn't trapping for money. He hadn't been to a trading post in 2 years, but for the furs that kept him from freezing to death. He paused near a jagged outcrop of granite. Something was wrong. The woods had a rhythm. Squirrels chattered. Jays scolded the wind, sighed. But today the woods were silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of holding one's breath. Thaddeus knelt in the snow. He brushed a gloved hand over a set of tracks that crossed his own path. They were fresh, perhaps an hour old. At first glance they looked like wolf prints, large, deep, distinct toe pads. A large male, perhaps the alpha of the local pack that hunted the ridge. But then he looked closer. Beside the paw prints there was a drag mark, and intermingled with the wolf tracks was something that made the hair on the back of Thaddeus's neck stand up. It was an impression of a foot. Not a boot, a bare foot. It was small, narrow, with splayed toes that gripped the ice. Human. Impossible, Thaddeus whispered, the sound harsh in the empty air. No human could survive up here barefoot. The temperature last night had dropped to 10 below zero. Frostbite would claim toes in minutes. Death would follow in an hour. Yet the track was unmistakable. It moved with the wolves not being chased by them. The stride was long. The weight distribution forward on the balls of the feet, suggesting whoever or whatever made this was running low to the ground. Thaddeus stood up, scanning the tree line. He gripped his rifle tighter. He had heard the stories from the Ute tribes before they were pushed out, stories of spirits that took the shape of men to lead hunters off cliffs. He didn't believe in spirits. He believed in lead and steel. He abandoned his trap line. The hunter in him took over. He followed the trail for 3 miles, climbing higher into the jagged peaks where the air burned the lungs. The tracks led toward a box canyon known as Devil's Throat, a place prone to avalanches and home to nothing but rock and wind. As he crested a ridge, he smelled it before he saw it. The metallic tang of fresh blood. Below him, in a clearing sheltered by spruce trees, a kill had taken place. A bull elk lay in the snow, its steam rising into the grey sky. Thaddeus flattened himself against the snow, pulling a brass telescope from his coat pocket. He extended the glass and trained it on the carcass. 3 timber wolves were tearing at the elk's flank. They were massive beasts, their coats thick and silver-grey. But they weren't eating alone. Thaddeus felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Crouched over the elk's neck was a figure. It was small, slight, covered in a patchwork of matted fur and dirt. Long, tangled hair, the color of dried wheat, obscured the face. The figure was using a jagged piece of slate rock to saw through the tough hide of the elk, working with a frantic, animalistic speed. The wolves didn't snap at the figure. One of them, the large alpha he had tracked, actually nudged the figure's shoulder with a bloody muzzle. The figure paused, turned, and rubbed its face against the wolf's neck. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 18 or 19, though grime made it hard to tell. She wore only a tattered deer hide wrapped crudely around her waist. Her upper body was bare to the biting wind, her skin smeared with mud and grease, likely for insulation. Thaddeus lowered the telescope, his mind reeling. He had seen men do terrible things to survive. He had seen the madness that isolation brought. But this was something ancient. He shifted his weight, and the crust of snow beneath his boot gave a loud crack. Down in the canyon, the reaction was instantaneous. The alpha wolf's head snapped up ears, swiveling toward the ridge. The girl froze. She didn't stand up like a human, looking for a source of noise. She dropped lower, her belly pressing into the snow, her head cocked at an unnatural angle. Thaddeus didn't move. He was 300 yards away, hidden by the ridgeline. He was a master of camouflage, but the wind shifted. It carried his scent tobacco gun oil and man down into the bowl. The girl let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a chuffing bark, identical to the warning call of a wolf. The entire pack abandoned the kill instantly. They didn't scatter in panic. They moved with military precision. The wolves flanked the girl, shielding her body with theirs, and they bolted for the dense timber on the far side of the clearing. The girl didn't run on 2 legs. She dropped to all 4s, her movements fluid and terrifyingly fast, springing off rocks and fallen logs with a grace that no civilized woman possessed. In 10 seconds, the clearing was empty. Only the dead elk remained. Thaddeus lay in the snow for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. He knew he should turn back. He knew that getting involved with whatever this was would bring trouble. He was hiding from the world for a reason. But as he stared at the empty woods, he remembered the look in her eyes, wild, feral, but unmistakably human. "Damn it," he muttered. He slid down the ridge, heading toward the carcass. He needed to see the tracks up close. He needed to know he hadn't lost his mind. When he reached the blood-stained snow, he found something the wolves had left behind. Caught on the splintered bone of the elk's ribcage was a scrap of fabric. It wasn't fur. It was blue velvet, faded and rotten, but unmistakably woven by a machine. Thaddeus picked it up. It was a piece of a ribbon, the kind a wealthy family might tie in a child's hair for a Sunday portrait. He looked toward the dark forest where they had vanished. This wasn't a spirit. This was a lost child who had survived the impossible. And if she was out here, someone somewhere had left her behind. Obsession was a dangerous thing in the high country, but Thaddeus McCall had never been a man of moderation. For 3 weeks following the sighting, he neglected his own survival. He barely slept. He spent his days scanning the ridges with his telescope and his nights fashioning heavier snares, not to kill, but to capture. He knew he couldn't just walk up to her. To the pack, he was a predator. To the girl, he was likely something worse, a stranger. The weather turned violent in November. A blizzard hammered the San Juans, dumping 4 feet of snow in 48 hours. The temperatures plummeted to 20 below. Thaddeus sat by his wood stove, listening to the wind batter the cabin walls. He worried about the girl. Wolves were resilient, but a human body, even one hardened by exposure, had limits. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke. The sun emerged, blindingly bright against the white expanse. Thaddeus strapped on his snowshoes and headed for Devil's Throat. He found them 2 miles east of the original sighting. The pack was in trouble. The deep snow had hampered their ability to hunt. They were moving slowly, single file, breaking trail. Through his glass, Thaddeus saw the girl. She was lagging behind. She was walking upright now, struggling to lift her legs high enough to clear the drifts. She looked thinner than before. Thaddeus shadowed them from the high ground, keeping parallel. He noticed the alpha wolf kept circling back, nudging her, urging her on. They were heading toward the lower valleys, where the deer congregated in winter. But the lower valleys were dangerous. That was cougar territory. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long purple shadows across the snow, the pack entered a narrow ravine lined with boulders. It was a perfect ambush point. Thaddeus saw the movement before the wolves did. Above the ravine, on a ledge of sandstone, a mountain lion crouched. It was a massive cat, gaunt from the winter famine, its tail twitching. The wolves were downwind. They couldn't smell the cat. "Move!" Thaddeus gritted out, racking the lever of his rifle. The cat launched itself. It didn't go for the alpha. It went for the weakest member of the pack, the girl. It was a blur of tawny fur and violence. The cat landed on the girl's back, driving her face first into the snow. The wolves erupted into a frenzy of snarls, turning to attack. But the deep snow slowed them down. The cat had the girl pinned, its jaws opening to clamp onto the back of her neck. Thaddeus didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the range or the wind. He simply exhaled and squeezed the trigger. Boom! The heavy point, 4.5-70 round, thundered through the canyon. The bullet struck the sandstone inches above the cat's head, showering the beast with rock shards. It wasn't a kill shot. Thaddeus had been afraid of hitting the girl. The cat shrieked a sound like a woman screaming and recoiled. The distraction was enough. The alpha wolf slammed into the cat's flank, teeth tearing. Thaddeus fired again this time, aiming for the ground in front of the fray to scare the cat off. The noise was deafening in the confined space. The mountain lion, realizing it was outgunned and outnumbered, scrambled up the opposite rock face and vanished. The wolves were in a panic. The gunfire terrified them more than the cat. They scattered, yelping. But the girl didn't move. She lay crumpled in the snow, a patch of red spreading across the white beneath her. Thaddeus threw off his snowshoes and slid down the embankment, risking a broken ankle. He hit the bottom of the ravine and ran toward her. 2 wolves, younger males, lingered near her, snarling at Thaddeus, teeth bared. Thaddeus didn't slow down. He roared at them, waving his rifle like a club. "Get go on!" Confused by this aggressive, loud, 2-legged creature, the wolves backed off, chuffing, and retreated to the tree line to watch. Thaddeus dropped to his knees beside the girl. She was conscious, but barely. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown, giving them a look of utter terror. They were a striking, piercing violet color, unnatural and startling against the dirt on her face. The cat's claws had raked across her shoulder and back. The cuts were deep, bleeding freely, but the spine seemed intact. She hissed at him, trying to scramble away, but her limbs failed her. She snapped her teeth, trying to bite his gloved hand. "Easy," Thaddeus said, his voice a low rumble. "I ain't gonna hurt you." She didn't understand the words. She only understood the tone. She trembled violently, partially from shock, partially from the freezing cold. Up close, the smell of her was overpowering wild animal pine resin and old blood. Thaddeus knew he had a choice. Leave her to the pack where the wounds would likely infect and kill her, or take her. If he took her, he was kidnapping a member of their family. The wolves would track him. They would besiege him. He looked at the tree line. The alpha was there now, watching with yellow, intelligent eyes. "I'm taking her," Thaddeus said to the wolf. "You can't fix this." He unbuttoned his heavy buffalo hide coat and wrapped it around the girl. She fought him, thrashing with surprising strength, screeching like a banshee. Thaddeus had to pin her arms to her sides, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, hollow bones and sinew. I know, he soothed, ignoring the fact that she managed to sink her teeth into his forearm through the wool of his shirt. He began the climb out of the ravine. He didn't look back, but he could feel the eyes on him. The pack didn't attack. They followed. The trek back to the cabin was a nightmare. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness. The snow was deepening as the wind picked up again. Every 100 yards, Thaddeus turned to check his back trail. 5 grey shapes shadowed him, staying just out of rifle range. When he finally reached his cabin, darkness had fallen. He kicked the door open and carried her inside the warmth of the cast-iron stove rushing over them. He laid her on his narrow cot. He turned to the door. The wolves were gathered at the edge of the clearing, a silent semicircle of sentinels. Thaddeus stepped out, rifle in hand. He looked at the alpha. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a strip of dried venison jerky, tossing it into the snow halfway between the door and the woods. "A trade," he grunted. He stepped back inside and threw the heavy wooden bolt, locking the world out. He turned to the cot. The girl was awake. She had pushed herself into the corner, clutching the buffalo coat, her violet eyes darting around the room, full of strange man-made objects. She looked at the lanterns, the hanging pans, the books. Then she looked at Thaddeus. She didn't growl this time. She made a small, high-pitched sound. A question. Thaddeus sighed, rolling up his sleeves to boil water. "Let's get you cleaned up, girl, before those friends of yours decide to come down the chimney." The cabin was a fortress, but to the girl it was a cage. For the first 3 days, the siege was absolute. Outside, the blizzard returned with a vengeance, burying the San Juans in white silence. Inside, the Battle of Wills was quieter, but no less violent. Thaddeus had been forced to bind her wrists with strips of soft buckskin. It wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. Every time he approached with a basin of hot water and carbolic acid to clean the cougar claw marks on her back, she fought with the desperation of a trapped badger. She didn't understand that the stinging liquid was medicine. To her, it was just another form of pain. "Quit it," Thaddeus grunted, using his hip to pin her legs to the cot as she thrashed. "If you don't let me clean this, the rot will take you, and I ain't digging a grave in frozen ground." She snapped at his face, her teeth clicking inches from his nose. Her violet eyes were wide, darting to the door every few seconds. She could hear them. Thaddeus could, too. The pack hadn't left. Through the thick log walls, the sounds penetrated the scratch of claws on the door, the heavy huffing of breath at the threshold. Occasionally, a low, mournful howl would rise above the wind vibrating through the floorboards. Every time the alpha howled, the girl would freeze. She would throw her head back her throat, working as she tried to answer. But Thaddeus had given her a mixture of laudanum and whiskey to dull the pain, and her voice was a croaking whisper. "They're waiting for you," Thaddeus said, wringing out a rag stained pink with her blood. "But you ain't going out there, not like this." The turning point came on the 4th night. The fever had set in. Her body, unaccustomed to the stifling heat of the indoors, burned hot. She thrashed in a delirium, muttering sounds that were half growl, half whimper. Thaddeus sat up with her exhausted. He had removed the bindings, so she wouldn't chafe her wrists. He sat in his rocking chair, his Colt Peacemaker on his lap, watching the fire die down. The girl woke with a gasp. She sat bolt upright, her eyes clearing for a moment. She looked at the door. The wolves were silent tonight. The storm was too loud. She looked at Thaddeus. She didn't snarl. She shivered. It was a violent, teeth-chattering rattle. The fever had broken, leaving her freezing in the drafty room. Thaddeus stood slowly telegraphing his movements. He picked up a heavy wool blanket from his own bed. He approached her the way one approaches a spooked horse, eyes averted, shoulders slumped to appear smaller. "Cold," he murmured. She watched the blanket. She tensed muscles coiling to strike. Thaddeus stopped 2 feet away. He didn't toss the blanket on her. He held it out. "It's wool," he said. "Better than deer hide." She stared at his hand. Then slowly she reached out. Her fingers were long, the nails broken and jagged, shaking with palsy. She snatched the blanket from his hand with sudden speed and retreated to the corner of the cot, pulling it over her head like a cowl. Thaddeus didn't smile. He just nodded and went back to his chair. An hour later he heard a sound that stopped his heart. Click, clack. He opened one eye. The girl had crawled off the cot. She was on the floor, moving on hands and knees. She wasn't trying to escape. She was under the table where he kept his supplies. She had found the dried venison jerky he kept in a tin. She couldn't get the lid off. She was gnawing on the tin, her frustration mounting. Thaddeus reached into his pocket and pulled out his Bowie knife. He tossed it so it slid across the floorboards, stopping inches from her hand. She recoiled, hissing. Then, seeing he wasn't attacking, she picked up the knife. She didn't hold it by the handle. She held the blade, cutting her palm slightly, but she didn't seem to care. She used the handle to smash the tin lid. It popped open. She gorged herself, eating with a ferocity that made Thaddeus's stomach turn. She didn't chew. She tore and swallowed. When she was done, she didn't retreat to the cot. She looked at the knife. Then she looked at Thaddeus. She slid the knife back across the floor toward him. It was a peace offering, or perhaps a recognition of hierarchy. In the pack, the alpha ate first, but the alpha also provided. Thaddeus had provided. "All right," Thaddeus whispered. "We're getting somewhere." He picked up the knife. As he wiped the blade, he noticed something on the floor where she had been crouching. A small, dark object had fallen from the tangle of her hair during her meal. He waited until she had curled up on the rug near the stove, preferring the hard floor to the soft bed, and fallen asleep. Then he walked over and picked it up. It was a locket, heavy silver tarnished, almost black by years of exposure. The chain had long since broken, and it had been tied around her neck with a piece of rawhide thong hidden beneath the matted mane of hair. Thaddeus carried it to the lantern. He used his thumbnail to pry the catch open. It was rusted shut, but the silver gave way. Inside there was no picture. The paper had long since rotted away from moisture. But on the inside of the lid, There was an engraving. It was faint, worn down by the friction of the skin and time, but readable in the firelight. To L.H. My Little Star, 1868. Thaddeus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. 1868. 10 years ago. If the girl was 19 now, she would have been 9 then. Old enough to remember language, old enough to remember a name. L.H., he muttered. He looked at the sleeping girl. The firelight softened the sharp angles of her face. Beneath the dirt and the scars, she had high cheekbones and a jawline that spoke of breeding, not peasantry. Thaddeus McCall knew the history of this territory. He knew the tragedies. And suddenly, a memory surfaced, a newspaper headline he had seen in Denver years ago before he walked away from the world. The Halloway Tragedy. Mining tycoon's family. Ambushed in High Pass. No survivors. Ezra Halloway. The Silver King of Durango. Thaddeus looked at the girl again. If she was Lucinda Halloway, she wasn't just a wild girl. She was the heir to one of the largest fortunes in the Colorado Territory. And she was supposed to be dead. Civilization came back to the girl slowly, like feeling returning to a frost-bitten limb, painful, confusing, and stinging. For 2 weeks, the cabin existed in a state of suspended reality. The blizzard had sealed the pass, meaning no one could come up, and they certainly couldn't go down. Thaddeus used the time to study her. She was learning. Her adaptability was terrifying. She watched him operate the stove, and by the 3rd day, she knew how to add wood. She watched him work the pump at the sink, and soon she was pumping water for herself, though she preferred to lap it directly from the spigot rather than use a cup. But she wouldn't speak. Thaddeus suspected she had lost the faculty of speech entirely, her vocal cords atrophied from disuse or reshaped for howling. "You got a name?" Thaddeus asked her one evening. He was whittling a piece of pine. She was sitting on the floor, shredding a piece of burlap to make a nest. She stopped and looked at him. "Name," he repeated, tapping his chest. "Thaddeus." She tilted her head. The violet eyes narrowed. "Thaddeus," he sounded out. She opened her mouth. A dry rasp came out. Zzzt. It was a start. "Good enough." He chuckled. He held up the locket which he had polished until the silver shone. Her reaction was instant. She launched herself across the room, snarling, her hand snatching the air. Thaddeus caught her wrist. She was strong, but he was stronger. "Easy," he barked. "It's yours. I'm just giving it back." He placed the locket in her palm. She clutched it to her chest, curling into a ball, rocking back and forth. She made a low, keening sound, pressing the cold metal against her cheek. It was her totem, the one thing that linked her to a time before the wolves. "L.H.," Thaddeus said softly. "Lucinda." The rocking stopped. The girl went rigid. She looked up, her eyes wide, with a sudden devastating recognition. The word clearly struck a chord, vibrating a string in her mind that hadn't been touched in a decade. "Lou," she whispered. The sound was foreign, clumsy. "Lou. Chin. Da." She said it as if tasting the word. Then she shook her head violently and growled, retreating into the corner. The name brought pain. It brought memories of Fool and blood. She rejected it. "All right," Thaddeus said, raising his hands. "No, Lucinda. Not yet." The truce held, but the outside world was encroaching. The weather cleared in early December, leaving the sky a hard, brilliant blue. The snow was packed hard enough to walk on. Thaddeus knew he had to check the perimeter. The wolves were still there. He saw their tracks every morning, but they had stopped howling. That worried him more than the noise. Silence meant they were hunting or they were plotting. "I'm going out," Thaddeus told her. He pointed to the door. "Stay." He treated her like a dog because it was the only language she respected. She watched him put on his coat and pick up the Sharps rifle. She moved to the door, wanting to follow. "No," he commanded. "Stay." He went out, locking the heavy bolt from the outside, a precaution he hated but necessary. Thaddeus hiked the ridgeline, checking for signs of other intruders. The cat came back, no. But he found something else, 2 miles down the canyon. Horse tracks. Shod horses. They were old, maybe 2 days partially filled with drift. But they were unmistakable. Someone had been scouting the valley floor. Bounty hunters. Prospectors, or men looking for the creature the locals whispered about. Thaddeus hurried back to the cabin, a knot of dread in his stomach. The isolation was broken. When he unlocked the door, he found chaos. The cabin was trashed. Pans were scattered across the floor. The flour sack had been ripped open, dusting everything in white. And in the center of the room, the girl was standing on the table, holding Thaddeus's old fiddle. She wasn't smashing it. She was holding it like a club ready to swing. But she wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the window. Thaddeus rushed to the window. Outside, pressing its nose against the glass, was the alpha wolf. It wasn't attacking. It was whining. The girl looked at Thaddeus, then at the wolf. She jumped down from the table and ran to Thaddeus, grabbing his coat sleeve. She pulled him toward the door, urgent, frantic. "Go," she croaked. "Go, go." "Go where?" Thaddeus asked. She pointed toward the woods, then made a gesture with her hand, a gun shape. She mimicked the sound of a gunshot. Boom. Thaddeus froze. She wasn't telling him to leave. She was warning him. The wolf had come to warn her. "Men?" Thaddeus asked. She nodded vigorously. "Bad. Men." Thaddeus grabbed his binoculars and kicked the door open. He ignored the alpha wolf, which bolted into the trees as he emerged. He ran to the edge of the porch and scanned the lower trail leading up to his hideout. There, winding their way up the switchbacks, were 4 riders. They were a mile out, but the sunlight glinted off the brass of their rifle scopes. They weren't drifting cowboys. They rode in formation. Thaddeus recognized the lead rider even from this distance. The long duster coat, the hat pulled low, the way he sat a horse like a sack of rocks. Silas Vane. The name tasted like bile. Vane was a regulator for the mining companies, a fixer, a man who cleaned up problems for the wealthy. If Vane was here, it wasn't a coincidence. He wasn't looking for a lost girl to save her. He was looking for a loose end to tie up. Ezra Halloway had died 10 years ago, but his company, Halloway and Sons, was now run by his brother Tobias. If Lucinda was alive, she was the rightful heir to the claim. If she was dead, Tobias kept it all. Thaddeus stepped back inside and slammed the door. He looked at the girl at Lucinda. She was trembling, clutching the fiddle bow. She knew who was coming. The wolves remembered the smell of the men who had killed her family, and she remembered too. "We got trouble, girl," Thaddeus said, reaching for his ammunition box. "Real trouble. Can you shoot?" She stared at him, uncomprehending. Thaddeus grabbed a secondary weapon, a smaller Winchester carbine. He shoved it into her hands. "Point, pull, kill!" She held the cold steel. The look in her eyes shifted. The fear evaporated, replaced by the cold violet light of a predator cornered. She bared her teeth. Thaddeus McCall had spent 5 years hiding from the world. But the world had found him, and it had brought the devil with it. He racked the slide of his sharps. "Let 'em come," he whispered. The first shot didn't hit the cabin. It hit the cast-iron skillet hanging by the door, sounding like a church bell struck by a hammer. Thaddeus didn't flinch. He was positioned at the window, the barrel of his sharps resting on the sill, a heavy wool blanket draped over his head, and the gun to hide the muzzle flash. "Down," he ordered without looking back. Lucinda was crouched behind the wood stove, the Winchester carbine clutched in her hands. She didn't look scared anymore. Her nostrils flared, inhaling the scent of gun smoke that was already drifting in. To her, this was a hunt. She was just the prey. "Thaddeus McCall." A voice echoed from the rocks below. It was Silas Vane. His voice was smooth-cultured and utterly devoid of warmth. "We know you're in there, and we know you have the creature. Send her out, and you can go back to playing hermit. No one needs to know you exist." Thaddeus stayed silent. He knew men like Vane. They didn't leave witnesses. If Thaddeus gave her up, they'd put a bullet in his head before her body hit the snow. "Stubborn!" Vane shouted. "Have it your way, old man." The canyon erupted. 4 rifles opened up simultaneously. The wood of the cabin splintered as heavy lead slugs punched through the logs. Glass shattered, spraying the interior with diamonds of ice and debris. Thaddeus waited. He wasn't firing blindly. He watched the puff of smoke from behind a boulder on the left flank. He exhaled, slowing his heart rate. Squeeze! The sharps kicked like a mule against his shoulder. Down the slope, a man screamed. Thaddeus had put a 500-grain bullet through the edge of the rock, sending stone shrapnel into the shooter's face. 1, Thaddeus counted. But they were pinned down. Vane's men were professionals. They moved while they fired, leapfrogging closer, keeping the pressure on. Bullets whizzed through the cabin, pinging off the stove and tearing through the bedding. Lucinda let out a shriek as a bullet shattered a jar of molasses next to her head, covering her arm in sticky, dark syrup. "Shoot back!" Thaddeus roared, reloading the single-shot rifle with practiced speed. Lucinda stood up. She didn't shoulder the rifle like a soldier. She held it at her hip, snarling, and fired. She worked the lever with a feral speed, crack, 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 crack. She wasn't aiming, but the volume of fire forced the men on the right flank to dive for cover. "Good girl," Thaddeus grunted, but they were running out of time. Vane was smart. He was flanking them, moving to the blind spot behind the cabin where the rock face met the roof. If they got up there, they could drop dynamite down the chimney. Suddenly, the firing stopped. The silence was heavier than the noise. "They're moving up the back," Thaddeus hissed. He looked at Lucinda. "We have to go. The tunnel." Thaddeus had dug a root cellar that extended deep into the mountain, a natural fissure he had widened. It exited into a ravine 100 yards behind the ridge. It was an escape route he hoped never to use. He grabbed his ammunition bag and his coat. "Move!" Lucinda hesitated. She looked at the door. Her ears twitched. "They are close," she rasped, the words clumsy but urgent. "I know," Thaddeus said. "No." She shook her head. She dropped the rifle and threw her head back. A sound tore from her throat that made Thaddeus's blood run cold. It wasn't a scream. It was a howl, long, mournful, and piercingly loud. It vibrated in the small room. Outside, the silence held for a heartbeat. Then the mountain answered. From the timberline above the cabin, a chorus of howls erupted. Not one or two wolves, the whole pack. And they were angry. The men outside started shouting, "What the hell is that? Look out above you!" Gunfire erupted again, but not at the cabin. The men were shooting into the trees. "Now!" Thaddeus grabbed Lucinda's arm and dragged her to the trap door beneath the rug. He threw it open, revealing the dark earthen moor of the tunnel. They dropped into the darkness just as a heavy thud shook the roof of the cabin. Someone had made it to the chimney. Boom! Dynamite. The explosion blew the stove door off its hinges and filled the cabin with soot and fire. But Thaddeus and Lucinda were already 20 feet underground, scrambling through the dirt and rock on hands and knees. They emerged into the blinding white of the ravine behind the ridge. The air was frigid, burning their lungs. Below them, chaos reigned. The wolves had descended like grey ghosts. They weren't engaging in a stand-up fight. They were snapping at heels, hamstringing horses, and vanishing back into the snow. Vane's men were panicked, their horses rearing and bucking. "Run!" Thaddeus commanded. He didn't head down the mountain. He headed up. Into the death zone. They ran until their lungs burned like they had swallowed coals. They climbed past the timberline into the barren expanse of rock and ice where nothing grew and nothing lived. By nightfall, they were 5 miles away from the cabin, huddled in a shallow cave, protected by an overhang of slate. The wind outside was a physical weight battering the mountain. Thaddeus struck a match, his hands shaking from the cold. He lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. He looked at Lucinda. She was curled in the corner, wrapped in the buffalo coat. She was shivering, but her eyes were alert. She was licking a shallow cut on her forearm. "We lost 'em," Thaddeus rasped, taking a swig from his canteen. "For tonight." Lucinda looked at him. "Wolf? Help?" "Yeah," Thaddeus nodded. "Your family came through. But Vane won't stop. He can't. If he goes back to Tobias Halloway without you, he's a dead man. He has to finish this." Thaddeus checked his gear. He had 20 rounds for the sharps, a box of shells for the Colt, and the carbine Lucinda had carried. Not enough for a war. "Why?" Lucinda asked. It was the first abstract question she had asked. She wasn't asking about food or warmth. She was asking for a reason. Thaddeus looked at the fire. "Why do they want you because of who your daddy was? Money, girl. It makes men do the devil's work." "No," she said, pointing a dirty finger at him. "You." "Why?" "You help." Thaddeus paused. He looked at the bearded, weary reflection in the back of his watch case. "I had a daughter once." He said the words feeling like gravel in his throat. "Before the war. Her name was Sarah. She died of the fever while I was off fighting. I came home to a ghost." He looked at Lucinda. "I came up here to die, I suppose. Just wanted to do it slow. But when I saw you, fighting that cat, surviving, I guess I decided I wasn't done yet." Lucinda crawled over to him. She didn't hug him. She did what the wolves did. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder and rested there, a gesture of absolute trust and submission. "Thad de us," she whispered. "Pack." "Yeah." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "We're a pack." The morning brought a cruel clarity. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a hard, unforgiving blue. Sound carried for miles. Thaddeus moved to the mouth of the cave and scanned the back trail with his glass. He saw them, 3 black dots against the white snow, moving slowly but steadily up the ridge. Vane and 2 survivors. They had lost their horses, likely the wolves had run them off, but they were tracking on foot. And they were good. They were following the tiny disturbances in the snow crust. "They're coming," Thaddeus said. He looked at the terrain. They were on a high plateau. Ahead lay the razor's edge, a narrow spine of rock with a 1,000-foot drop on either side, leading to the sanctuary of the inner peaks. Crossing it exposed them completely. "We can't outrun them," Thaddeus said. "Not in deep snow. They have long rifles." He looked at Lucinda. "We have to stop running. We have to make them afraid." "Afraid?" Lucinda tilted her head. "Wolves hunt," Thaddeus said. "How do you hunt a bear?" "You don't bite it. You tire it. You confuse it." Lucinda's eyes lit up. She understood hunting. "We split," Thaddeus said. "I go high. You go low. We lead them into the Devil's Throat." Devil's Throat was the box canyon where he had first seen her. It was an acoustic nightmare. Echoes bounced everywhere, making it impossible to tell where a sound came from. And it was prone to avalanches. Thaddeus took the heavy Sharps rifle. He gave Lucinda the lighter Winchester carbine. "You don't shoot unless you see the whites of their eyes," he instructed. "You move, you make noise, you make them look at you. Then I take them." She nodded. She stripped off the heavy buffalo coat, revealing her lithe form, wrapped in the flannel shirt and buckskin trousers he had modified for her. She needed speed now, not warmth. She moved to the edge of the cave. She looked back at him one last time. "Pack," she said firmly. Then she vaulted over the edge, sliding down the snow face on her heels, moving with that terrifying fluid grace. Thaddeus watched her go. Then he turned and began the grueling climb up the vertical rock face. He had to get above them. He had to become the ghost of the mountain one last time. An hour later, Silas Vane reached the plateau. He was breathing hard, his face burned by the wind, his eyes hidden behind dark goggles. "Tracks split," one of his men said, pointing. "One set goes up the rocks, the other goes down into the canyon." Vane looked at the tracks. "The mountain man went up. He wants the high ground. The girl went down. She's panicked." "Split up?" the henchman asked. "No." Vane smiled, a cruel twisting of lips. "The man is nothing without the girl. We get the girl, he comes to us. We follow her." They headed down into the Devil's Throat. High above, prone on a ledge of granite, Thaddeus McCall watched them through his scope. He adjusted the elevation dial. The wind was cross-canyon, 20 miles an hour. A difficult shot. "Come into my parlor," he whispered. Below, Lucinda was running, but she wasn't running away. She was circling. She moved through the scrub brush, making just enough noise to keep them interested. She barked a sharp yipping sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Vane spun around. "There, in the rocks." His men raised their rifles. Crack. The sound of the Sharps from the high ridge didn't reach them before the bullet did. The man on Vane's right spun violently, his shoulder disintegrated by the heavy slug. He dropped into the snow, screaming. "Sniper!" Vane roared, diving behind a boulder. "He's above us!" The echoes made it sound like the shot came from everywhere. Lucinda popped up from behind a log, 50 yards to their left. She fired the Winchester, bang, bang, kicking up snow in Vane's face. "She's over there," the remaining henchman yelled, swinging his rifle toward her. Crack! Another thunderclap from the sky. The henchman's rifle shattered in his hands, the impact knocking him backward. Thaddeus was surgically taking them apart. Vane was alone now, pinned behind a rock, with a wounded man screaming and another disarmed. He looked up at the towering cliffs, unable to see his executioner. "McCall!" Vane screamed, his voice cracking. "You can't kill us all. The Holloway Company owns this territory. They'll send an army." Lucinda moved closer. She was creeping through the deep snow, silent as smoke. She circled behind Vane's position. Thaddeus chambered his last round. He had a clear shot at the top of Vane's head, but he didn't fire. He saw Lucinda. She was 10 feet behind Vane, holding a jagged rock in her hand, the rifle forgotten. She had reverted. The gun was a tool, but the rock was instinct. Vane heard the crunch of snow. He spun around, raising his pistol, but he was too slow for a girl raised by wolves. Silas Vane was a killer of men, a veteran of range wars and boardroom betrayals. He was fast. But Lucinda was not fighting like a man. She was fighting like a desperate animal protecting its territory. She slammed into Vane with the force of a battering ram, her shoulder driving into his gut. The air left his lungs in a violently audible whoosh. The pistol in his hand, a heavy Remington, discharged into the sky, the crack of the gunshot magnified 1,000 times by the acoustics of Devil's Throat. They hit the snow in a tangle of limbs. Vane roared, smashing his gloved fist into the side of her head. It was a blow that would have knocked a grown man unconscious, but Lucinda just snarled, shaking her head to clear the stars. She clawed at his face, her fingernails hardened and jagged, baking deep furrows down his cheek. "Get off me, you witch!" Vane screamed, thrashing in the deep powder. He managed to get a knee up, driving it into her chest and throwing her off. He scrambled backward, gasping for air, blood streaming from his face, blinding his left eye. He groped in the snow for his gun. High above, Thaddeus cursed. The melee was too chaotic. If he fired now, the bullet could easily pass through Vane and hit the girl. "Lucinda, move away!" Thaddeus bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Vane found his gun. He raised it, leveling the barrel at the girl who was crouching 10 feet away, preparing to spring again. "Enough!" Vane panted, thumbing the hammer back. Crack! It wasn't a gunshot. It sounded like the earth itself, spine snapping. Vane froze. Lucinda froze. Even Thaddeus, 1,000 feet up, felt the vibration through the rock beneath his belly. The gunshot had done what Thaddeus feared. The echoes had vibrated the heavy, unstable cornice of snow hanging over the lip of the canyon, tons of wind-packed ice, waiting for a trigger. "Look up!" Thaddeus screamed, though he knew they couldn't hear him over the rising roar. Vane looked up. His expression shifted from rage to absolute, primal terror. The white sky was falling. A wall of snow 50 feet high and moving at 60 miles an hour was cascading down the chute directly above them. Lucinda didn't look up. She felt the pressure change in the air. She didn't try to outrun it, that was impossible. She spotted a massive overhang of granite, a shark's fin rock jutting out of the canyon floor near the wall. She didn't look at Vane. She dove for the rock, scrambling into the small pocket of air beneath its lee side. Vane stood paralyzed, the pistol dangling from his hand, watching his doom descend. "No," he whispered. The white wave hit. The sound was deafening, a roar that blotted out all thought. The canyon floor disappeared in a churning cloud of ice dust. Trees were snapped like matchsticks. Boulders were tossed like pebbles. Thaddeus watched from his perch, horrified, as the white river swallowed everything Vane, the dead henchman, and Lucinda. "Lucinda!" he screamed, standing up on the ledge, heedless of his own safety. The slide lasted for a minute that felt like a century. Then the silence returned, heavier and colder than before. The canyon floor was gone, replaced by a smooth, undulating blanket of white debris 20 feet deep. Thaddeus abandoned his rifle. He scrambled down the treacherous goat path, sliding, falling, tearing his clothes on jagged rocks. He hit the canyon floor, running, sinking to his knees in the concrete-hard avalanche debris. "Lucinda!" he roared, tearing at the snow with his bare hands. "Answer me, howl, damn you, howl!" Silence. He ran to where he had seen the shark's fin rock. It was buried. Thaddeus began to dig. He dug until his fingernails tore and his hands bled. He dug like a madman, sobbing breaths racking his chest. He was a man who had lost everything once. He refused to lose this. "Not again," he grunted, heaving a chunk of ice aside. "Not again, Lord. Take me, don't take her." His hand struck something hard. Stone. The tip of the overhang. He redoubled his efforts, clearing a hole alongside the rock face. "Lucinda." A sound, faint, muffled, like a whimper from deep underground. Thaddeus shoved his upper body into the hole he had dug. "Girl, grab my hand." A dirty, trembling hand reached out of the darkness. Thaddeus gripped it with a strength born of desperation. He pulled, bracing his legs against the snow. Slowly, agonizingly, he dragged her out. She was blue with cold, coughing up ice dust, shaken and bruised, but alive. The rock had created a perfect air pocket. Thaddeus didn't care about dignity. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest, burying his face in her matted, dusty hair. He rocked her back and forth, tears freezing in his beard. "I got you," he choked out. "I got you." Lucinda clung to him, her small body trembling violently. She buried her face in his coat, inhaling the scent of tobacco and sweat, the scent of safety. "Pack," she whispered, her voice raspy. Thaddeus looked around the devastated canyon. There was no sign of Silas Vane. He was buried under tons of ice, entombed in the mountain he had tried to conquer. The mountain had dispensed its own justice. Thaddeus looked up at the ridge. Standing there, silhouetted against the setting sun, was the alpha wolf. It looked down at them for a long moment, dipped its head in a silent acknowledgement, and turned away, vanishing into the wilderness. They were alone. History is often written in ink, but the truth is written in scars. Thaddeus McCall and the girl known as Lucinda Halloway did not return to civilization immediately. They couldn't. The world of men was not ready for them, and they were not ready for it. Instead, they moved deeper into the Uncompahgre. Finding a new valley, one untouched by maps or mining claims, they rebuilt. They survived. It wasn't until the spring of 1880 that a man walked into the law offices of Halloway & Sons in Denver. He was wild-looking with a beard to his chest, wearing buckskins that smelled of pine smoke. Beside him stood a young woman. She was dressed in fine clothes that looked uncomfortable on her, but her eyes were a piercing, unforgettable violet. She spoke little, but when she did, the room fell silent. She carried a silver locket and a knowledge of the family history that only the true heir could possess. The legal battle was short. Tobias Halloway, faced with the resurrection of his dead niece and the looming threat of an investigation into Silas Vane's disappearance, folded. He took a payout and fled out to Europe. Lucinda Halloway became one of the wealthiest women in Colorado. But she was a ghost in her own mansion. She refused to sleep in a bed, preferring a pile of furs on the balcony. She ate her meat rare, and on full moons the servants whispered that they could hear her on the roof singing a strange, mournful song to the mountains in the west. Thaddeus McCall did not stay in the mansion. He couldn't live in a city. He returned to the San Juan's building, a cabin on the land. Lucinda now owned land she declared a protected reserve, forbidding all mining and logging. They say she visited him every summer. They say she would ride out alone, disappearing into the timber for weeks at a time, leaving her fortune behind to run with the wolves once more. Thaddeus died in 1903. He was found sitting on his porch rifle across his lap, looking out over the valley. Lucinda lived until 1934. She never married. She was known as the Wolf Queen of the West, an eccentric philanthropist who donated millions to conservation. When she died, her will gave explicit instructions. She was not to be buried in the family crypt. She was to be cremated and her ashes scattered in a box canyon known as Devil's Throat. If you hike the San Juans today, deep in the Weminuche wilderness, you might find an old rotted cabin built against a rock face. And if you listen closely when the wind blows through the spruce trees, you won't just hear the wind. You'll hear the call of a pack, and in the center of it, a voice that sounds almost human, wild and free, singing the song of the mountain. That is the story of the mountain man and the wolf girl. A story of survival of blood and of the unbreakable bond between two souls who found each other when the rest of the world had left them for dead. Whatever happened to the gold of the Halloway family or the exact location of Thaddeus's cabin remains a mystery to this day. But the records in the Denver archives confirm that a Lucinda Halloway did return from the dead in 1880, accompanied by a nameless mountain man. It's a reminder that sometimes the wildest stories are the ones that are actually true. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the wild history of the American West. If this story moved you, or if you just love the untold tales of the frontier, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with a friend who loves a good mystery, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon. You never know what's watching you from the woods.